The ballroom was all crystal chandeliers and white roses, the kind of wedding that cost more than most people earned in a year. Then the bride pointed at a man near the VIP section, plain suit, worn shoes, a small envelope in his hand, and told security to remove him. In front of every guest in that room, Emily looked at Daniel Carter and said he had no business being there. He said nothing. He simply walked out while the laughter followed him through the doors. 30 seconds later, 3 black Rolls-Royces pulled up to the entrance and the groom ran. The Grand Meridian Hotel was the kind of place that made people feel like they needed to earn the right to walk through its doors. The lobby alone had 20-foot ceilings, imported marble floors that reflected the light like still water and flower arrangements that cost more than most monthly rents. The staff who worked there had a particular way of moving, efficient, invisible, trained to anticipate. And on the night of the wedding, every surface had been dressed in white and gold, and the chandeliers threw soft, fractured light across the faces of 400 guests who had all, in one way or another, come to be seen as much as to celebrate. It was exactly the kind of event Emily Hartwell had been planning since before Ryan Caldwell ever put a ring on her finger. Daniel Carter arrived alone the way he always did at events like this. He wore a dark navy suit that had seen a few too many dry cleaning cycles, and his shoes were clean, but clearly not new. He carried a small card envelope in his jacket pocket and moved through the lobby without stopping to look at the flower arrangements or the ice sculpture near the entrance. He had received a personal invitation from Ryan 3 weeks earlier, a handwritten note, not a printed card, and he had almost declined it twice before deciding that not showing up would be the wrong kind of statement. He was not a man who made statements. That was the whole point. The guest list was a cross-section of everything money could pull into the same room. Real estate developers, a few city council members, the kind of investors who never needed to introduce themselves because someone else always did it first. Daniel found his assigned seat in the VIP section without asking anyone for help, settled in quietly, and accepted a glass of water from a passing server. He did not take the champagne. He set the card envelope on the table in front of him and left it there, and for a while he simply watched the room the way someone watches a room when they have no interest in being part of its performance. He noted the table arrangements, the careful choreography of the catering staff, the way certain guests angled their bodies toward the most visible points in the room. He noted which men checked their phones and which ones didn't, which conversations involved eye contact, and which ones involved scanning over the other person's shoulder for someone more useful. He had been in rooms like this his entire adult life and had long since stopped finding them interesting. What he found occasionally was people worth paying attention to, and Ryan Caldwell had been one of those people from the first conversation they had ever had in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee, when Ryan was 31 years old and 3 months from losing everything he had built. He had known Ryan Caldwell for 7 years. That was not a fact he wore on his face. Emily Hartwell moved through her own wedding reception the way a general moves through a campaign, with total awareness of every room, every table, every person who might matter, and every person who did not. She had spent 11 months planning this event, and she intended for every detail to reflect exactly the life she had worked toward. The flowers were correct. The lighting was correct. The seating chart had been revised 4 times. The menu had been changed twice after tastings that she had attended with a written checklist. What was not correct, and what she noticed within the first 40 minutes of the reception, was the man sitting in the 3rd row of the VIP section who looked like he had wandered in from a different zip code entirely. She spotted Daniel from across the room and felt a particular kind of irritation, the kind that arrives when something is visibly out of place in a space you have curated down to the centerpieces. She did not know his name. She did not need to. What she saw was a man in an outdated suit, sitting among the most well-dressed guests at her wedding, holding a water glass instead of champagne, with a small white envelope on the table in front of him that could not have contained anything worth noticing. He was not speaking to anyone. He was not trying to make conversation with the people around him. He was simply sitting there with the settled ease of someone who had nowhere else to be and no particular need to justify his presence. And that ease, more than the suit or the shoes, was what irritated her most. She turned to her maid of honor, a sharp-faced woman named Vanessa, and said without lowering her voice, "Who let that man into the VIP section?" Vanessa glanced over and shrugged lightly. "He was already seated when I came in. He has a place card." Emily's jaw tightened. "That doesn't answer my question." She crossed the room with the kind of deliberate pace that makes people move out of the way without being asked. A few guests noticed and turned their attention in her direction, the way people do when they sense that something is about to happen. Emily stopped a few feet from Daniel's table and looked at him directly, her expression carrying all the warmth of a formal complaint. "Excuse me," she said. "I don't think I know you." Daniel looked up. His expression did not change. "Daniel Carter. I'm a guest of Ryan's." Emily glanced down at the envelope on the table, then back at him. Her eyes moved across his suit with the kind of slow assessment that was designed to be felt. "Ryan has a lot of associates," she said. "He doesn't always think carefully about the guest list." The guests at the surrounding tables had gone quiet. Not completely, there was still ambient noise from the far end of the ballroom, but in the immediate radius of that exchange, people had stopped their own conversations to listen. A man at the nearest table set his fork down. A woman 2 seats over turned slightly in her chair, not enough to be obvious enough to hear. Daniel did not respond. He simply held her gaze, which seemed to bother her more than any reply would have. Emily's voice carried further than necessary when she spoke again. "This is a private event for people who belong here. I don't know who you are or how you got a seat in this section, but I can tell you right now that you're not dressed for it. And whatever you brought in that envelope." She nodded toward the table. "I'm sure it's very thoughtful." The last 3 words landed like the opposite of what they meant. A few people nearby laughed, the soft, uncomfortable kind that happens when someone in a crowd decides it's safer to go along than to object. Someone at the next table, a woman in a beaded dress, who would later spend the rest of the night avoiding eye contact, leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made him smile. Daniel heard it. He did not react to it. He set his water glass down with the same unhurried steadiness with which he had picked it up, and he looked at Emily with the patient attention of someone who has decided that the most powerful thing they can do in this moment is absolutely nothing. What happened next was not a gradual escalation. Emily had decided on an outcome before she finished walking across the room, and she moved toward it without hesitation. She turned and gestured to one of the security staff stationed near the side entrance, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who had been hired through the hotel's event team, and said clearly enough for the nearest 30 guests to hear, "Please escort this gentleman out. He's in the wrong section." Marcus looked uncertain. "Ma'am, he has a place card." "I'm the bride," Emily said. "This is my wedding. Please remove him." The room had gone noticeably quieter by then. Ryan was on the far side of the ballroom near the bar, deep in a conversation with his business partners from the West Coast. He had no line of sight to the VIP tables, and no reason to look over. His phone was in his jacket pocket on silent. He had no idea what was happening 30 feet behind him. Daniel stood before Marcus reached him. That was the detail that people would remember later. Not that he was removed, but that he stood on his own terms without being touched, without being asked twice. He straightened his jacket, slowly smoothed the front with one hand, and looked at Emily one more time. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, with something that was harder to read than either of those things, and because of that, harder to dismiss. Then he reached down, picked up the small card envelope from the table, and held it for a moment, before placing it back deliberately. Not forgotten, not abandoned, but left there on purpose, in the way that people leave things when they want the object to say what they will not. He walked toward the exit at a pace that made it impossible to tell whether he was being escorted or simply leaving. Marcus walked 2 steps behind him, which only reinforced the ambiguity. Several guests tracked Daniel's path across the room. None of them said anything. The guests who had been watching turned back to their tables. The conversations restarted, slowly gaining momentum, the way conversations do when people are processing something and need the cover of noise to do it. Someone near the front flagged down a server for more champagne. Emily smoothed the front of her dress, lifted her chin, and returned to the center of the room, where the lighting was better and the attention was easier to manage. At the table where Daniel had been sitting, the small white envelope rested against the base of a crystal water glass. No one touched it for a long time. One guest glanced at it and then looked away. Another reached toward it. It thought better of it and pulled her hand back. It sat there in the middle of a table full of people who were no longer comfortable looking directly at it, carrying the particular weight of something that has been placed rather than forgotten. Outside the ballroom, the corridor leading to the main hotel entrance was wide and carpeted in deep charcoal gray. Daniel walked it without looking back. His hands were loose at his sides. A hotel staff member near the elevator caught his eye and gave a small apologetic nod, the kind that meant she had heard something through the walls and felt bad about it. Daniel returned the nod without expression and continued toward the front entrance. The night air outside the Grand Meridian was cool and carried the clean sharpness of a city evening before weather moves in. The hotel's circular driveway was lined with luxury sedans and a few SUVs from the private car services that guests had used to arrive. A valet near the far end stood with his hands clasped, watching nothing in particular. Daniel stood at the top of the entrance steps and did not reach for his phone. He did not look back at the hotel doors. He looked out at the street beyond the driveway, at the low amber light of the city at night, and he stood there with the stillness of a man who had survived worse rooms than the one he had just walked out of. He had chosen silence back there, and he did not regret it. Causing a scene would have accomplished nothing except confirming every assumption that woman had already made about him. He knew what she had seen when she looked at him, a suit that had aged shoes that hadn't been replaced, a plain envelope. She had made a complete assessment of a person in under 10 seconds, and she had been so certain of it that she had acted on it in front of 400 people without once considering that she might be wrong. He was not angry. He was something quieter than angry, and in some ways more durable. The thing about being judged by surfaces was that it said nothing about the person being judged, and everything about the person doing the judging. Daniel had understood this for a long time, not as a philosophy he had read somewhere, but as something he had learned through specific experience in rooms where the stakes were real and the consequences lasted. He had stopped explaining himself to people like Emily Hartwell years ago, not out of arrogance, but because the explanation was never what they needed. What they needed was time and the events that came with it. Tonight had simply accelerated that process. Inside, the reception continued. The band had moved into its second set. The champagne was flowing. Emily Hartwell stood near the head table, accepting compliments on her dress, on the venue, on the flowers. Everything exactly as she had planned it. Across the room, Ryan Caldwell laughed at something one of his partners said and reached for his glass, completely unaware that the most important person he had invited to his wedding was currently standing on the front steps of the hotel alone, in a suit that cost less than the centerpieces. That was the end of the first hour. It would be the last hour of the evening that anyone remembered. The 3 Royces arrived without announcement. There was no advance call to the valet, no hotel staff positioned to receive them, no choreography of any kind. They simply turned off the main street and rolled into the Grand Meridian's circular driveway. One after another, black and low and completely silent, the way expensive things often move when they have nothing to prove. The lead car pulled to a stop at the base of the entrance steps, exactly where Daniel Carter was standing, and the other 2 came to rest behind it in a line that stretched nearly to the street. The valet, who had been watching nothing in particular, was now watching this very carefully. 4 men stepped out of the vehicles in quick succession. They were dressed in dark suits that fit correctly, and they moved with the practiced efficiency of people whose entire job was to be useful without being noticed. One of them carried a phone, another carried a leather portfolio, a third positioned himself near the lead car's rear door without opening it, which meant whoever was inside had not yet decided to come out. The fourth walked directly toward Daniel and said something in a low voice that the valet could not hear. Daniel listened, nodded once, and said something brief in return. The man with the portfolio opened it, extracted a single document, and handed it across. Daniel looked at it for no more than 15 seconds, signed it with a pen produced from his jacket pocket, and handed it back. The whole exchange had the quality of something that happened on a regular Tuesday, a transaction so routine that the people involved had long since stopped assigning it any significance beyond the practical. That quality, more than the cars or the suits, was what unsettled the people watching from the lobby windows. None of it looked like a performance. That was the part that made the two guests who happened to be standing near the entrance go very still. Inside the ballroom, the shift in energy arrived before any information did. It moved through the room, the way a change in air pressure moves through a building, not loud, not visible, but felt. The first person to bring it inside was a woman named Patricia Doyle, who had stepped out to take a call and come back in through the main entrance, just as the cars were pulling up. She had stood at the top of the entrance steps for a full minute before coming back inside, watching what was happening in the driveway, and by the time she returned to her table, she had already decided that whatever she had just seen was not something she was going to keep to herself. She leaned toward her husband and said in a voice she did not bother to keep quiet, "There are 3 Rolls-Royces out front, and they stopped for the man Emily just threw out." Her husband looked at her. "What man?" "The one in the navy suit, the one she had security walk out." He turned toward the entrance, though there was nothing to see from where he sat. Around them, the table had gone quiet, and then the quiet spread to the next table, and then the one after that, moving outward through the room like something dropped into still water. Emily was near the cake display when the first whisper reached her. She caught the words, "Rolls-Royce," and dismissed them immediately. She had seen men try to save face at social events before arriving with rented cars, dropping names that didn't belong to them, manufacturing impressions on the way out the door. She assumed without much thought that this was a version of that. She turned back to the conversation she was having with her mother and did not look toward the entrance. Vanessa appeared at her elbow 2 minutes later, and the expression she wore was not one Emily had seen on her before. "You need to come look at something," Vanessa said. "I'm in the middle of..." "Emily." Vanessa's voice was flat in a way that had cut through the surrounding noise. "Come look." The guests near the entrance had formed a loose cluster, the kind that develops when people want to see something, but are trying to appear as though they are not trying to see it. Emily moved through them and looked out through the tall glass doors of the lobby toward the driveway. The 3 black cars were still there. Daniel was standing near the lead vehicle, speaking with one of the suited men who had arrived with them. He was not performing anything. He was not looking back at the hotel. He was simply having a conversation, and the men around him were positioned in the unmistakable configuration of people who defer to someone. Emily watched this for several seconds. "He hired cars," she said. "He's trying to make a point." Vanessa said nothing, because she had already seen what Emily had not yet processed, that 2 of the guests, still inside both of them, serious men, the kind who did not gossip and did not react to things without reason, had noticed the vehicles and gone visibly pale. One of those men was a developer named Warren Cole, who had built 3 of the largest commercial properties in the city over the past decade. He had excused himself from his table the moment he recognized the monogram on the lead car's rear window, a detail so small it would mean nothing to most people, and everything to someone who knew exactly who used it. Warren Cole stood near the lobby now with his phone in his hand, not using it, just holding it. The way people hold things when they are processing information they were not prepared to receive. He had attended hundreds of events like this one over the course of his career. He had shaken hands with governors and senators and people who ran industries that moved more money in a quarter than most governments managed in a year. He had never once looked the way he looked right now. The other man was a finance attorney named Gregory Marsh, who had worked with enough investment structures to recognize from 30 feet away the particular composition of a principal and his team. He had encountered Daniel Carter once before, years ago at a closed-door meeting that he had been brought into briefly before being asked to step out. He had spent considerable time afterward trying to identify the man at the head of that table, had asked careful questions through careful channels, and received careful non-answers every time. He had eventually concluded that whoever the man was, he did not want to be found. He knew now. The knowing arrived with the particular unpleasantness of information that comes too late to be useful, and just in time to be deeply uncomfortable. Gregory walked to Warren's side, and the two of them stood together near the lobby entrance without speaking. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more efficiently. Back in the ballroom, Ryan Caldwell's phone had been buzzing against his jacket pocket for the last 4 minutes. He had ignored the first 2 vibrations because he was mid-sentence with a partner. He felt the third and reached for it out of reflex, glancing at the screen while still half-turned toward the conversation. The message was from his assistant, sent from somewhere inside the hotel. "Carter is outside." "Did you know he was coming?" Ryan read it once. Then he read it again. His partner said something that Ryan did not hear. Ryan said, "Excuse me," to no one in particular, and walked away from the bar at a pace that was almost but not quite a run. He crossed the ballroom in under 20 seconds, which was fast enough that a few guests turned to watch him. He pushed through the lobby doors, scanned the entrance area, and found the glass doors that looked out onto the driveway. Through them he could see Daniel standing near the lead Rolls-Royce, still in the same quiet conversation, still not looking back at the building. Ryan was through the lobby and out the front entrance before anyone could ask him where he was going. He took the entrance steps 2 at a time and called out across the driveway, "Daniel!" Daniel turned. Ryan crossed the remaining distance and stopped in front of him. And what happened next was not what the guests beginning to gather at the lobby windows had expected. Ryan Caldwell, the groom, the man whose wedding was currently in progress. 40 feet behind them, the man whose name was on the venue contract, and the catering invoice, and the floral arrangements, lowered his head toward the man in the worn navy suit, in a gesture that was unmistakably a bow. Not theatrical, not performed for anyone watching. Just the instinctive deference of someone who had learned a long time ago exactly what he owed, and to whom. "I didn't know you were here," Ryan said. "I didn't know what happened inside until just now." Daniel looked at him steadily. "It doesn't matter." "It does," Ryan said. "It absolutely does, and I'm sorry." At the lobby windows, Warren Cole had his arms crossed and was looking at the floor. Gregory Marsh had quietly moved away from the glass, as if distance from the scene might reduce his association with everything that had occurred in the last hour. A cluster of other guests pressed closer, their expressions cycling through confusion and discomfort, and the dawning unpleasant recognition that the evening had taken a shape none of them had anticipated. Inside the ballroom, the news had arrived fully formed. It traveled not as gossip this time, but as fact, carried by people who had seen the cars with their own eyes, who had watched Ryan run across the room, who had now heard through the open lobby doors the word that kept circulating among those who recognized Daniel Carter's name: the fund. People in the city's financial circles knew the fund, the way they knew landmarks, not always by the person behind it, because the person behind it had been extraordinarily careful about that, but by its effect. The investments that had appeared at exactly the right moment to keep 3 mid-sized companies from collapsing. The silent backing behind 2 of the largest development projects Warren Cole had ever completed. The capital that had moved through the city's business infrastructure over the past 7 years. Like water, through a system of pipes, present everywhere, visible nowhere. The man in the worn navy suit was the source of all of it. Emily Hartwell had been standing in the lobby doorway long enough to hear most of this. She had heard Warren Cole say Daniel's name in a low voice to someone beside him, with an expression that did not match anything she had seen on him before. She had heard the phrase "the fund" more than once. She had watched Ryan bow his head on the front steps of her wedding venue, and she had understood in that moment that the architecture of the evening had shifted entirely beneath her feet. She stepped out through the lobby doors. The cool night air hit her as she moved down the entrance steps. She had rehearsed composed exits from difficult situations before she was good at them, had always been good at them. But nothing in her preparation had accounted for this specific combination of circumstances, and the composure she assembled on the way down the steps was visibly assembled rather than genuine. She stopped a few feet from where Ryan and Daniel were standing and arranged her expression into something that was meant to look like grace under pressure, but arrived as something closer to damage control. "Mr. Carter," she said. Her voice was careful now, deliberate in the way a voice gets when it is trying to recover lost ground. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were, and I—" Daniel turned to look at her. He did not say anything immediately, and the absence of a quick response made the sentence she had started feel worse than it already was. "I'd like to invite you back inside," she continued. "The evening is still—" "That's all right," Daniel said. His tone was not cold. It was something more difficult to argue with than cold. It was simply final. He looked at her, the way someone looks at a situation they have already fully assessed and closed. There was no heat in it, no performance of forgiveness, no cruelty. Just the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had already made his decision and was not going to revisit it because she was now aware of his net worth. Emily stood on the steps of her own wedding, with nothing to say for the first time all evening. The apology she had come outside to deliver had not been the right kind of apology, and some part of her knew it, and the knowing made the silence worse than any response could have. Ryan had gone quiet beside her, but his silence was different from hers. He was watching Emily not with anger, yet but with the careful attention of someone who was seeing something clearly that he had previously only half understood. He had known that Emily placed weight on appearances. He had told himself over the course of their relationship that this was a manageable quality, that it would soften with time, that the part of her that was drawn to surfaces would eventually be balanced by the part of her that was capable of more. What he had just watched her do in front of Daniel, and more than that, what he had just watched her try to undo the moment the surface changed, was not a manageable quality. It was the whole structure. He looked at the woman he had been about to marry, and saw with the particular clarity that arrives too late, and all at once exactly who she was. Inside the ballroom the band was still playing. The guests who had remained at their tables were pretending to have conversations. The guests who had drifted toward the lobby were not pretending anything anymore. The white envelope that Daniel had left on the VIP table was still there, untouched, resting against the base of the crystal water glass, where he had placed it before walking out. No one had opened it. No one was sure they were allowed to. Ryan Caldwell walked back into the Grand Meridian alone. Daniel had not asked him to stay outside, and Ryan had not offered to. There was an understanding between them that did not require negotiation. Daniel would handle his own evening, and Ryan had something he needed to go back inside and do. Emily had already turned and gone through the lobby doors ahead of both of them, moving quickly in the way people move when they are trying to get somewhere before the situation does. Ryan followed at his own pace. On his way through the lobby, he stopped at the VIP table long enough to pick up the small white envelope that Daniel had left. He tucked it into his jacket pocket without opening it, and kept moving through the lobby and back into the ballroom, where the band had finally stopped playing, and the room had settled into a low, uncertain murmur that was nothing like the atmosphere of an hour ago. The guests who remained had rearranged themselves in the particular way that people rearrange themselves when an event has shifted and they are waiting to see what comes next. Closer together, voices, lower eyes moving toward the center of the room. Emily's mother, a sharp-featured woman named Carol Hartwell, intercepted him before he reached the microphone. She had the look of someone who had been managing crises at social events for 30 years and intended to manage this one the same way. "Ryan," she said, keeping her voice low and her smile technically in place. "Whatever just happened outside, this is not the moment. There are 400 people in this room." Ryan looked at her steadily. "I know exactly how many people are in this room." Carol's smile thinned. "Then act like it. Whatever issues you have, they can be addressed privately. This is not the place." "With respect," Ryan said. It became the place the moment Emily made it one. He moved past her without waiting for a response. He walked to the center of the room where the microphone stand was still positioned from the earlier toasts, and he picked up the microphone. The feedback tone that followed brought the remaining murmur down to nothing. Every face in the ballroom turned toward him, the guests at their tables, the catering staff along the walls, the band members with their instruments in their laps, Emily standing near the head table with her hands at her sides, and an expression she was working very hard to control. Ryan did not look at the room the way a man looks at a room when he has prepared something to say. He looked at it the way a man looks at a room when he has decided to stop preparing and simply tell the truth. "Most of you know me," he said. "Some of you have done business with me. A few of you have known me long enough to know that 7 years ago the company I had spent 4 years building was 3 months from bankruptcy." He let that sit for a moment. "I didn't talk about it publicly at the time, and most of you don't know the details. What happened was that someone stepped in quietly. No announcement, no press, no conditions attached to his name, and provided the capital that kept everything from collapsing. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't ask for visibility. He asked for nothing except that I run the company well and pay it forward when I was in a position to do so." The room was completely still. The kind of still that only happens when a large group of people have all simultaneously decided to stop pretending they are doing anything other than listening. "That man came to this wedding tonight because I asked him to come. I wrote him a personal invitation because I wanted him here, because there is no version of this evening, or any evening, I will celebrate for the rest of my life, where his presence is not significant." Ryan's voice did not waver, but it had changed in register lower now, and more deliberate. He was seated in the VIP section because that is where he belongs, and he was asked to leave by the person who should have been the first to welcome him. Emily's face had gone completely still. "I'm not going to describe what happened in this room earlier in detail," Ryan continued, "because enough people saw it, and the details aren't what matters. What matters is that I watched the woman I was about to marry walk across this room, humiliate a man she had never spoken to, and have him removed from his seat, based entirely on the way he looked. And then, when she found out who he was, I watched her walk outside and try to invite him back in." He looked toward the head table, toward Emily, and his expression held no cruelty, just the flat honesty of a conclusion that had already been reached. "Those two things together tell me everything I needed to know." Carol Hartwell said. "Ryan," from somewhere near the side of the room, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Ryan set the microphone down on the stand. "I'm sorry to every guest here for the disruption. The evening is over." What followed was not chaos exactly, but it was not order either. It was the particular social confusion of a room full of people who had witnessed something real and did not know the correct response to it. Some guests stood immediately reaching for jackets and clutch bags with the relieved efficiency of people who had been waiting for permission to leave. Others remained seated, looking at each other with expressions that asked whether leaving now was better or worse than staying. The catering staff near the walls had all found reasons to look at the floor, or at the ceiling, or at the middle distance between the two. Emily did not move from where she was standing. Her hands were still at her sides, and the expression she had been working to control had finally given up on being controlled. She looked like someone standing in the wreckage of a structure they had spent a long time building, trying to identify the single point of failure, and finding instead that the failure was distributed across the entire foundation. Her mother reached her and put a hand on her arm and said something close to her ear. Emily did not respond to it. She was looking at the head table at the white tablecloth, and the flowers, and the 2 empty chairs that had been arranged to face the room, trying to calculate whether there was any version of the next 10 minutes that did not end the same way. There was not, and the understanding of that arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a slow, heavy settling the way a building doesn't fall all at once. Vanessa found her briefly said something practical about the car service and the venue deposit, and then moved toward the exit, with the efficiency of someone who had already made a decision about where her loyalties were and what the evening had cost her. She did not look back. Emily watched her go and said nothing. Outside, Ryan found Daniel still near the lead car. The 3 Rolls-Royces had not moved. Daniel's team had given them space positioned nearby, but out of earshot, and Daniel was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the street the way he had been looking at it when Ryan had come out the first time. There was nothing performed about his posture. He was simply a man standing outside at night, waiting for a conversation he already knew the shape of. Ryan stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was a version of the conversation that did not require the beginning to be narrated. "I said what needed to be said," Ryan offered finally. Daniel nodded. "I heard. I should have been paying attention earlier. I should have been there when it happened." "You weren't there," Daniel said, "because you were at your own wedding. That's not a failure. What she did was her decision. Don't carry it like it belongs to you." Ryan looked at the pavement. The weight of the evening sat on him in a way that was different from embarrassment. It was more like the specific exhaustion of a person who has just made a decision they know is correct and irrevocable and expensive. He thought about the years it had taken him to build what he had, and the single evening it had taken to understand what he had been building it beside. 7 years ago, he said, "You told me that the only real measure of a person is what they do when no one who matters is watching." I've thought about that a lot. "Apparently not everyone has," Daniel said. There was no bitterness in it. Ryan let out a short laugh that was not quite a laugh. "What are you going to do now?" "Go home," Daniel said simply. "It's been a long evening." Ryan nodded. He reached into his jacket and produced the small white envelope. He held it out toward Daniel. "You left this inside." Daniel looked at the envelope for a moment, then at Ryan. "Open it." Ryan pulled the flap open. Inside was a card, plain, no decoration, and written on it in Daniel's handwriting were 4 lines. Not a long speech, not a formal message, just the kind of thing a person writes when they mean it and don't need it dressed up. Ryan read it without speaking, and when he looked up, his expression had changed in a way that was difficult to categorize. It was not sadness exactly, and it was not gratitude exactly. It was the particular look of a person who has just been reminded in the middle of an evening that tried very hard to be about surfaces, that there are people in the world who operate from an entirely different set of values, and that he had been fortunate enough to learn from one of them before it was too late. "Keep it," Daniel said. He shook Ryan's hand firmly briefly, the way men shake hands when the thing being communicated is not about the handshake, and then he turned toward the lead car. One of his team opened the rear door without being asked. Daniel got in, and the door closed, and the 3 black Rolls-Royces began to move out of the circular driveway in the same quiet, unhurried procession with which they had arrived. Ryan stood at the base of the entrance steps and watched them go. The tail lights of the last car disappeared around the corner, and then the driveway was just a driveway again. Valets parked sedans, the faint sound of the city beyond the entrance gates. Back inside the Grand Meridian, the ballroom was emptying. Guests filed out through the lobby in clusters, their voices low, their expressions carrying the particular weight of people who had attended an event they would be discussing for a long time. The flowers were still perfect. The chandeliers were still throwing fractured light across the marble floor. The ice sculpture near the entrance had begun to lose its edges in the warmth of the room, its clean lines softening slowly into something unrecognizable. At the head table, 2 untouched plates sat beside 2 empty champagne flutes. Emily Hartwell stood in the middle of the ballroom after most of the guests had left. The catering staff moved around her quietly, beginning the process of clearing glasses and folding napkins, the mechanical disassembly of an event that had not concluded the way anyone planned. Her mother had stopped trying to reach her and was in the lobby handling something with the venue coordinator. The room that Emily had spent 11 months designing looked exactly the same as it had at the start of the evening. The flowers were still white and gold. The lighting was still exactly what she had specified. Everything was still exactly as she had arranged it, and none of it looked like anything she recognized anymore. She had walked into this room tonight with a complete picture of what her life was going to look like, who she was going to be, what she was going to have, what kind of man she was going to stand next to at the center of it. She had protected that picture carefully, managed it, curated it the way she curated everything. And she had lost it, not to something large or unpredictable or outside her control. She had lost it to a single decision made in under 10 seconds, in front of 400 people based on a suit and a pair of shoes. There was a version of this night where Daniel Carter had walked into the ballroom and she had done nothing. Where she had let him sit in his assigned seat and drink his water and present his plain envelope and leave when the evening was over. That version of the night still existed somewhere in the space of things that could have happened, and in that version, she was still standing at the center of the room she had built beside the man she had chosen, with everything intact. Instead, she was standing here alone in the dress, in the perfect lighting, with nothing to manage and nothing left to protect. Outside, Ryan Caldwell was still on the entrance steps with a small card in his hand. The city moved around him the way it always does, indifferent, continuous, making room for nothing and waiting for no one. He read the 4 lines one more time, then folded the card carefully and placed it back in his jacket pocket. He did not know yet what the next weeks would look like, or the months after that. What he knew was that the most clarifying moment of the entire evening had not been the cars, or the room going silent, or the speech he had given into a microphone. It had been standing on a driveway, watching a man in a worn navy suit sign a document, hand it back, and return his pen to his pocket with the complete indifference of someone who has long since stopped needing anyone's approval to know exactly who he is. The Grand Meridian's driveway was empty now. The night air was cool and clear, carrying only the ordinary sounds of a city that had continued without interruption. Through all of it, the distant hum of traffic, a siren somewhere far off, the soft mechanical sound of the hotel's front doors, opening and closing as the last guests filtered out. Somewhere down the block, a car passed, without slowing its headlights, sweeping across the pavement, and then gone. The evening was over.